To everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jamie Morgan-Besser from the Australian Red Cross National Recovery Team, and thanks so much again for joining us for today's webinar with Dr. Rob Gordon, Supporting Our Children. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, today's webinar is being presented by Australian Red Cross webinar/community forum. We've received feedback that 2-hour webinars are just too long for people, so we've decided to make this an hour session with Dr. Rob to get to the key points. Now, Red Cross's recovery program is based upon the Australian National Disaster Recovery Principles and draws upon the Community Recovery Handbook, research from the Beyond Bushfires research program, as well as our own domestic and international experience. Our programs are all hazards, consequence focused, and work closely with local services, all levels of government and community groups. As a result of our community-led approach, all of our recovery programs are reflective of the communities we work in. Now, following the 2019-2020 bushfires, Red Cross has committed to a 3-year program across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I would just like to cover a couple of housekeeping topics. Today's session is being recorded and we'll be able to share a link with you after the session is complete, and we welcome you to share the content with colleagues as well and other people in your community. We also invite your comments and questions, so if you could just see the Q&A chat box, please feel free to type that in and I'll either pose the question to Dr. Rob at the beginning or when it's appropriate. Now, Dr. Rob is a clinical psychologist who has been working in the field of disaster recovery since Ash Wednesday in 1983. He is a consultant to the Australian Red Cross and has worked with people and communities after the Port Arthur shooting, the Bali bombings, Black Saturday, the Christchurch earthquakes, and most recently with communities impacted by the Black Summer fire events. So we're living in unprecedented times, and it can be especially challenging for parents, for caregivers and educators to know how best to support the children and young people in our lives. None of us have lived before through such a complex period. I think you've been hearing this on and off for a very long time. From kids' experience of transitioning back to face-to-face classroom lessons, learning after so long away, to anxiety and stress around COVID-19, the long journey of bushfire recovery, potential of the upcoming disaster season, and the looming anniversary of last year's devastation. Dr. Rob, I'll hand over to you and you can help us work through some of those issues.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start with just focusing on thinking about what did we all do to adjust to this period of isolation from the COVID in our various ways. It's something we had no choice about. We had to do it. Just like disasters, we don't have any choice unless we choose not to live in one area or another. But what did we do to adjust? I think that's one of the essential questions we have to ask, because we do adjust. We do make changes in the way we not only behave and so on, but how we actually manage our feelings, most of us. So one of the things I'd ask parents, caregivers, teachers, educators to try and observe. You probably know most of the kids. You'll know your own kids, of course, from before this time. And while it's been going so long that it's been a significant period of development for the kids, I think the question is, what adjustments and changes have they made in order to deal with this time? And how do we pick that up by comparing them as they are now, coming out of the isolation, to how they were before they went into it? How have they changed their pattern of peer interaction, their contact with friends? Maybe it's online now as opposed to in the flesh. How have they changed their mode of behaving in the family? How have they changed the activities they're engaged in? They haven't been able to do a lot of things that they would normally have done. So what have they done instead? How have they changed the pattern between the time they spend having fun in recreation, playing if they're younger, or hanging out with their friends if they're teenagers, versus work. I don't mean schoolwork, I mean helping out at home and making their bed and all the rest of it. Because when we think about these adjustments, they're not going to be able to tell us, I've adjusted this and that and the other, because when we're under stress, we are not conscious of the adjustments we make because they're driven by the way the various demands and difficulties and issues impinge on us, and we adjust ourselves. If we get yelled at for doing this, we avoid it. If we feel silly doing that, we avoid it, and so on. And so if we feel lonely, we don't like to be in our rooms, etc. So I'm trying to say that the adjustments will be driven by the need to deal with things. So we don't really have a clear picture of that. So looking at these areas, the important areas, what adjustments have been made to family life? What adjustments have been made to social interactions, peers, and just interaction with people generally? What adjustments have been made to the activities, the kind of things that kids spend their time doing, what they're interested in? And I think what's really important is routines. Routines are regular patterns of behaviour that we engage in without thinking about. Routines are like anchor points. They're stable structural features of our world. It's not just a whole lot of chaotic behaviours, but we get up at a certain time, we brush our teeth, we have meals, we, do whatever on a regular basis. And they anchor our expectations for the future. And one of the things we've learned working in bushfires is that we know this from looking after young children, is that routines are incredibly important as a security structure. And I remember my own kids, when we would break routine, go out late at night and, visiting somebody with all our kids, and they'd go to bed late and have a bad night's sleep and so on. It would take a few days to get them back in routine, their sleeping routines and so on, and things would be a bit stressful and difficult. So we can see how routines create that structure. With teenagers, routines are equally important, but they're different types of routines, and they're more to do with how the kids feel and what they want to do. So therefore, I think one of the really important things is taking stock of the changes, bearing in mind that if we lose routines, we lose security and confidence. And that means we start to feel ill at ease and anxious, disoriented, disorganised. We adults have this if we lose our routines, don't we? I forget things and I can't remember where I put things because I've lost my usual way of putting things in certain places. And the more stressed I get, the more I fail to establish routines to deal with all the pressures I've got on me. And so this is something I want to come back to, because presumably most families established an isolation routine system. Working at home, parents maybe, kids learning at home, and eventually you settle into a routine. You've got to upend that and go out into the world again. So what are some of the impacts we notice from this isolation? I think one of the things that we can assume it's going to do is it's going to put on hold a lot of the work that we know is essential for recovery from a disaster, recovery from exposure to threatening and dangerous and traumatic events. Because that's all about processing it. Well, that's a technical word for digesting it. But that all involves communicating and comparing our experience. And a lot of that's been disrupted. So what do we do? Well, I think one of the things that I've been hearing about is that there are a bunch of kids who have taken the opportunity to hide from their anxieties. So we know that some kids love going to school and find it easier to deal with than being at home if there's tensions at home. They enjoy seeing their friends. They quite like the schoolwork. They like playing sport. But other kids are not so successful at sport. They find it harder to get on in the playground. They have difficulties with their schoolwork, and so it's always a little bit stressful and hard work, and they need a bit of encouragement. So the kids who go to school looking forward to it and enjoying it are experiencing a sense of loss, frustration, unhappiness at missing their friends. Perhaps their sense of self and their confidence comes from the continual reinforcement of that in day-to-day activities. The other kids who find it harder to make friends and struggles at school and feel silly when they get the sums wrong or something like that. I remember my own school experience. It's a relief not to be going there. And so we can find kids will hide from their anxieties and they'll settle into online learning. How did that change from the first to the second isolation period lockdown? I know that teachers have told me that they've noticed quite a significant change in the way the kids were online towards the end of the second lockdown period. Whereas to begin with, they'd be all up there and with their screens on and talking and so on. By the end of the time, they were sort of often there without their screens on, and the teachers didn't feel they had contact. I wonder how general that is, really, the feeling of the kids have somehow withdrawn into their own world. And I think that would be their routine for coping with this very uncomfortable and unusual situation. Another factor, apart from hiding from your anxieties or feeling frustrated that you've got to give up something very important, is the loss of opportunities for creative self-expression. We need to remember, particularly for young children, that play is a really important area of learning and development. That the experiences at school, while schoolwork in the classroom might be okay, it's the fun they have in the playground and the opportunity to learn to get on with each other that really helps them grow and feel increasing sense of confidence in themselves. So we've got this sudden restriction of the scope of activities. That's not just the restriction of the scope of things they like doing, but self-expression and the opportunity to sort of find themselves in the world. And when they're at home, it suddenly changes. Now, we don't know what that's meant to the kids, and the kids probably can't tell us, but they feel a kind of vague sense of dissatisfaction. It could be, on the other hand, that some kids really have thoroughly enjoyed the increased opportunity for closeness at home, spending more time with parents becoming part of their schoolwork. And so there are a whole lot of positives there that maybe they're going to miss when they go back to school. So in each case, these factors have got this complementary aspect. So when they lose that social environment, what do? Well, we know that many kids simply substitute an online environment. And we know that's got its own hazards, its own complexities, its own schoolyard bullying and embarrassments and so on. And the kids probably don't always tell us about it, just as they don't always tell us about upsetting things that happen in the playground where they're made to look foolish. So I think that there's probably been a pattern where they've altered a whole mode of interaction. And let's assume they probably had to cope with a lot of things that they don't necessarily tell us about unless we really invite them to. And so I reckon even if they've got an online environment, I suspect that they can't share everything. And it's very likely that most kids and teenagers have gone into themselves over this period of time. It'd be, let's say, probably a safe assumption to make that children have become more self-sufficient. Perhaps that's the best word. You know, just trying to meet everything within myself. I think it's great if in families we've encouraged kids to keep talking about what it's like. We can do that, by the way, not by asking them how they feel, although some kids are very happy to talk about that, not all of them. But if we ask them what they've been doing, what's been happening, how were they able to deal with things? Try to find a way of asking the question in the terms in which they've probably been experiencing it, problems and so on. Now, I want to just think about this going into themselves in terms of its impact on development. We've had a period of, you know, most of the year. Now, for us adults, for an ancient person like me, years it's just another year. So, you know, they go faster and faster, I find. And a year's nothing. But of course, for a 5-year-old, it's a fifth of their life. For a 14-year-old, it's a very long time. And what's more important, usually a year represents a shift from one developmental stage to another, one way of feeling, one way of seeing the world, one load of expectations to another. And so they've been in a very unusual situation now for a significant period of their development. What's the effect on that? Well, I think it's worth bearing in mind that what preserves the process of development is this combination between what emerges from the child and how it's met by opportunities from the environment. So that if a child, let's take a simple example, is really wanting to learn to ride a bike, sees other kids riding a bike, there's a point at which, oh, it's too complicated and advanced and demanding. I'm not big enough for that. I'm scared of falling off and skinning my knees. And then a little bit later on, I'd really like to have a go at that. That looks like so much fun. And I have tried a scooter on 2 wheels, and I'm getting a bit more confidence that 2 wheels is safer. I really want to have a go. I really want to have a go. Now, there's an ideal spot where, okay, here's the bike, have a go, and I'll show you. And where, in fact, the tension's built, they have the opportunity, and wow, they break through. And then the great excitement and joy and sense of satisfaction. Now, I'm sure as adults we can all remember times of doing that. And I can remember the first time I caught the tram by myself with a friend. My mum had been telling me I could catch a tram up and go to the movies or something or another. And, you know, I didn't feel big enough, and she persuaded me and said, what about get your friend to go with you? And we went, and nothing happened. We got on the right stop, got off and came back. And I was so proud of myself. I felt grown up. You know, it's that timing. It's feeling the courage and the opportunity. Now, that means there's a whole emergence of emotional strength and opportunity and enthusiasm that has to come out, and the environment has to meet it at that point. And we know that when we look at kids who've had traumatic experiences, or their families have been through tough times, or the parents are incredibly worried about money or having difficulties in other ways, if there's illness and all the other sorts of problems that you can have in life, the kids actually are very busy coping with this load of worry and emotion. Now, kids don't worry like us adults do, you know, lying in bed, tossing and turning and turning, but they worry deep down in their hearts. And they just, you can see they just don't look happy. They don't really look as though they're concentrating. They don't engage in enjoyable activities. They don't feel like doing whatever their happy hobbies are. They listlessly mope around saying, I'm bored. This is a sign that they're preoccupied, but they don't know what with. They're just preoccupied with the emotional load. Now, I think there's a really important function whereby children draw on the energies that would normally be pushed out into the world as enthusiastic hope for opportunities for the next stage of development. In other words, the step forward into the world is motivated by all the excess energy and enthusiasm that's been generated by the achievements of the previous stage, the sense of fulfillment. And I've got to be met by the opportunities to give expression to this, which is coming out, being met. We know that if children aren't met by the right opportunities at the right time, it spoils the opportunity for the whole thing to be a nice, smooth development process. It's about what the curriculum is, isn't it? It's the presentation to children at various stages, the kinds of mental content and so on that will fire them up and match their developing capacity. Now, I reckon it would be safe to assume that in the lockdown process and layer over that the bushfire recovery process, that this smooth emergence of interest and capacity and motivation being met by opportunities to produce the next stage of development is at least been not as smooth as it should be, and perhaps has been disrupted. I think it's really important to pick up those disruptions, because I think if kids miss the opportunity, they lose the opportunity to develop confidence. So if I had been too scared, or my mum hadn't been confident enough to push me out onto the tram to catch that first tram ride and start to develop a sense of independence, I'd actually keep feeling it was too difficult and too difficult and too difficult. And if suddenly there wasn't, I don't know, something happened and it wasn't safe to go out for a year, you know, it would actually seem like a huge problem to me. It'd be harder to do it. Now, I think what I've picked up is that if we go back to that notion that some kids will have withdrawn and taken the opportunity to avoid areas of development which are stressful and hazardous, and now when they come back, they're tentative and nervous and they're not sure how they're going to be accepted and so on. And the other kids who've been frustrated and so on are going to come out and burst onto the scene, but maybe they won't be sufficiently sensitive. Who knows? I think there'll be lots of lumpiness, lack of coordination between the kids. Now, this need to hold back and use the resources for development in managing your anxiety means we go back to an earlier stage where we've already achieved it all. We don't have to use our deeper emotional resources, so we can apply them to our worries. And what this looks like is the child doesn't feel like being a 9-year-old. They're behaving more like a 7-year-old or maybe a 6-year-old. And maybe that's shown up in all sorts of ways. They want us to sit by the bed and tell them stories when previously they were happy to, you know, have a story and go off to sleep by themselves. Or it's too hard for them to get themselves organised to do their homework if they're a 13 or 14-year-old. They need to be, you know, prompted and guided and organised the way they needed to be a few years earlier and so on. And when you get through to teenagers, say the issue of responsibility, just it's all too hard. I don't want to do it, and so on. So where we get that picture of a child not really, or a young person not really operating at their age level, you've got this element of regression. And I think when we pick that up, it's really important to say regression follows this need to conserve resources to deal with something. And so the question is, what are they dealing with? Now, if only they could tell us. I think we've got to pick it up by our understanding of their life circumstances. We need to listen to their conversations. With younger children, we need to watch their play. What do they play? Fire engines all the time? Do they play doctors or people dying of illness and ambulances? You know, what's their worry? Listen to the kids when they talk. Do they talk about the news? Do they ask how many COVID cases, you know? And I think we can just take those opportunities to open a conversation, not really do too much, but just say, have you been thinking about that? Yeah, what do you think about that? Do you feel worried about it? Well, this is what we're doing about it, so that we offer the children and young people information and understanding that nests into their questions and their worries. And we can just look around us. If, you know, the family's in financial problems, we can ask them, are you worried about, you know, dad's been retrenched or mum's not working or whatever? And then, you know, we need to preserve an adult perspective. I know that some children have been saying that they are really worried how long this will last. Will it ever go away? Now, of course, a year is just next to infinity for a child. And it must feel like this has lasted forever. And this is where I think it's most important for us as adults to give a perspective that allows them to preserve some optimism. And to do that, we've got to get a conversation going. We've got to let them know that, yes, there was a big illness like this when your grandma was a little girl, and it lasted for a few years. But it eventually went away and everyone went on as usual and lived a really normal, happy life. Probably this won't last as long because the doctors are trying to find a vaccine and blah, blah, blah. Whatever story we're telling. It doesn't have to be so much correct in detail, and we don't need to burden the kids with all the complexities and uncertainties of will we find a vaccine and what are the pros and cons of taking. We just need to give them a picture that actually we will get through this. We will come out the other side, even if it's going to take longer than we all would like. It's this sense of confidence that we need to communicate to them. So I'd say that when we think about what do we do here, I think step one, evaluate the impacts. And this comes back to really sitting down and looking at the kids. How are they compared to where they were halfway through last year and so on? How have they changed in their routines? And then not just drifting from lockdown into, you know, struggling through and compromising and trying to get life going, and it's difficult and we're trying to improvise every day. Try and think, you know, with your partners and even friends and people who've got kids your age, talk about how you're doing things. And, you know, if it's very hard to get your teenager out the room and off his computer or her computer and getting ready for school and so on, try and think about how you do things and build up a routine. What time they wake up? What's the routine when they wake up? Is there a way you can wake them up gently? Give them notice, you know, pamper them a little bit. Not too much, but just a little bit, you know. To let them have a gentle awakening and then build up an expectation. Now, the wonderful thing with routines, if you just do the same thing enough times, our body chemistry starts to expect it. And we ease into it, but we've got to build that. So we've got to design a routine around life requirements, weekdays, weekends, whatever. Try and design it. Think about how it would work. Just as we do for our work, we try to design how to do things, maybe how you're going to do things in the kitchen if you're going to cook a meal. And then restore or build supportive routines. The third principle is if the kids are showing signs of regression, therapeutic regression, in other words, going back to an earlier stage to conserve their ability to deal with the worries, start from there. Start from there and nurture them and support them where they are, and they will slowly start to move forward. What we've got to do is try and address the worries they've got. Even if we don't know exactly what they are, I think it's such an important principle of resilience to preserve a sense of optimism and confidence, even if we don't feel it ourselves. Now, without being secretive, preserve a degree of privacy so that, you know, you don't have a conversation about your deepest worries on the phone, in the kitchen, at the top of your voice with your best friend while the kids are sitting in the next room. Do it after they've gone to bed. We're not keeping it secret. We're having boundaries of privacy. There are certain adult concerns that the kids don't have to carry. We'll work it out somehow. I'm pretty worried about it right now, but I'm sure we'll get through it somehow. We can then talk to the kids about it. Yes, we are worried about this, but you'll give it in a more controlled message, which actually wraps around it the confidence that we will somehow get through it. And we know that there's a lot of evidence that if we take care of the kids at the age of which they have gone back to, as they feel confident, their innate urge to keep developing will start to re-emerge. And that's what you want to wait for, when they're ready to start doing things. And that's where we will see that they will then want to be where they ought to be, and they will start to make up that ground. Now, I reckon there's going to be a lot of concern about missed time. Now, I can speak as a psychologist, I don't have to speak as a teacher, but I think from the psychology of it, if kids have lost ground academically, socially, emotionally, whatever else, or even in terms of their skills and so on, it makes sense that we've got to start from where they are. We can't suddenly ask them where to jump to where they should be. And if they're really struggling, let's help them achieve what they can achieve. And then they'll get a good feeling about it rather than keep pushing them to try to get them to catch up. Because what we want most of all is that sense of achievement. I'm getting somewhere, I'm having success, I'm learning, I'm quite enjoying the learning. So that this starts to get a momentum going, so that that will be the thing that will motivate them to catch up. Even if they're not going to catch up in one term. I don't think a lot of kids are going to catch up in one term. But if we make that a constructive experience, I'll be very surprised if they're not well on the way by the end of next year. But we've got to start from where they are. So that means really individualising our understanding of our children where they are. Nurturing and supporting. So we talk about evaluating the impacts, restoring supportive routines, starting from their regression where it is, nurturing and supporting them where they are. So I think in my experience, parents often and teachers often get a bit sort of confused. You know, it feels a bit indulgent for a child of this age to be asking for this much help. Do we indulge them, or do we say, no, come on, pull yourself together and get on with it, you're old enough to do this? Well, maybe they do need a bit of a sort of push along, but like, it's too hard for me to take the rubbish bin out. No, come on, you can take the rubbish bin on. But maybe there are other things where it just feels too hard. And we actually say, well, okay, you don't have to do it at the moment, but is something that you will need to do. So let's talk about how we do something in between. You don't want to take the rubbish bin out if that's too hard. Will you, I don't know, change the dog's water or something? There's some other little, just get them back in doing a few chores. I think a nurturing and supportive attitude is really very important for kids, because they're not very good at telling us how uneasy and unhappy they feel. I think it's very important for us to encourage the kids to tell a story of their isolation period. What was it like? What was it like to begin with? How's it gone? How have they adjusted themselves? What's it been like recently? This interesting observation of the teachers that the kids don't come online anymore, or they don't turn their screens on. Why is that? Do they not feel comfortable, or are they sick of it all, or whatever? Do they feel as though no one cares, or what? You know, try and get them to actually speak about that. And this is there again when we try to put this in some kind of history where this fits in the whole process, so that this kind of conversation of what's going on should allow us to actually talk about this year of COVID and what it means. Can we then, what are we up to, about 6th, how can we develop adaptive transitional activities? You know, kids don't want to go to football practice anymore, or they're a bit nervous about doing this, that or the other. They're finding school really hard. Can we organise they need a bit of a phone call with some of their ex-friends, or the friends they might have had before that they haven't catching up with, just finding what's going on, just as parents sort of nurturing some kind of getting them back into the social activities, motivate their confidence and achievement by trying to organise for them and encourage them to do things they can actually do and get this sense of satisfaction. An observation I've made is from what people have been telling me is that a number of kids, and particularly this is a problem with adolescents, is pessimism and cynicism. This is such an important aspect of teenage years, because teenagers have got this ability to think and see through us adults, to see what we do as opposed to what we say. And if things are difficult all the time, they get pessimistic and cynical. And so I think we you know, encourage them to talk about that with us. Often the answer to that is to bring to their attention a lot of things that maybe aren't on the news, where good people are doing good things and trying to help each other out. That however much we're talking about climate change, my goodness, in my lifetime, there's such a consciousness of it now that there was no trace of. You know, we can see these positive movements, to bring these to their attention. Not that we're minimising the problems, we want them to be able to tackle them, but to actually speak about this. And I think that just to sort of bring it together, you know, one of the observations that was made in the research on children and disasters is that something that correlates very much with how well the kids are doing psychologically is a factor they call the emotional tone in the family. So if there's negative emotional tone, people are grumpy and irritable and yelling at each other and not looking after each other, and people don't, you know, that's associated with poor outcome than if people are being nice to each other and caring for each other. And I think a very simple thing that we can invest a lot of energy in is just being polite and preserving our manners as adults. You know, just treating each other with respect and dignity. This is a massive contribution to the lives of the kids. Just a simple thing we can do. And this boundary about not spilling the beans on everything, talking about our worries because they know they're there, but put them in a context that's got a more thoughtful And if we lose our temper, saying, sorry, I had a bad day yesterday, sorry I yelled at you, you don't then say, but don't you do it again. Just say, I'm sorry I yelled at her, I was having a bad day. Let's talk about how we do this better next time. And to sort of finish up, I'd just say, I think a very simple guideline in helping kids emerge out of a difficult time is make sure you try to spend time just giving them your full attention regularly and see what comes of that. If they're teenagers, they'll feel restless and they don't want to spend too much time hanging out with the old fogies, but still make it available. It may be when they're eating after they come home from school or something. Just sit there and be with them and then let whatever happens evolve from that so that they know you're really interested in them. You're not going to put anything on them, you're just interested and you enjoy being with them. I think these are really important subtle factors that all get swept away in the hurly-burly of our stressful lives. Look, I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions. I'm sure there are many other aspects that we could cover.
Yeah, thanks heaps, Rob. That's been really, really helpful. I know for me, working with some kids in my community. So I wonder, there was a question that came through earlier on, Rob, with regards to what are the best resources and programs available to support young people to be able to undertake peer-to-peer mental health support?
Yes. Well, now, I think there are various programs. I can't tell you exactly what they are, but I'm sure if you were to make contact with either local government or maybe through the BRV hubs, you'd be able to get access. There are a number of agencies that work with young people, and maybe you're right that giving a little bit of education in those skills, whether it be at school or after school, just giving kids a few tools to talk to each other. I think that's a great idea, but maybe we can, Jamie, we can put some links up on the BRV website, on the Red Cross website.
Absolutely. One of the other questions that came through was, what can community and youth workers, what can they do to get these programs up locally, including long-term and ongoing support mechanisms? So more as a community-led initiative, Rob.
Yes, well, I think that we know that that's what's going to really count, is that the people feel it's coming from us. And so what I'd be suggesting is you start communicating with hub coordinators if you're in bushfire affected areas, because we would see this as exactly the kind of community-led principle that is fundamental to the National Disaster Recovery Guidelines. You could possibly talk to your community recovery committees, see if they can make links for you. And I would suggest that you look around for the agencies who focus on this. You know, VIC. Now, I'm not going to be sure exactly what it stands for. Youth
Affairs Council for Victoria.
Yeah, thank you. Is planning to undertake some programs to help kids actually do exactly this sort of thing. So watch out for that. But I think there are a number of other groups that are working in the area. But anything that helps kids get out and be together with others and tackle some of the problems will be very beneficial. There's a question here, younger children, 2 to 3 year olds. Look, observations of even very young children, even kids under the age of 1. I know, I've been told about a case of a child who's in his first year and delayed in his motor milestones, and the family's been in lockdown, which means he's actually mixed with any other babies, because playgroups have been shut down, haven't they? Now, does that mean he hasn't actually seen what he should be doing? by seeing other babies crawling and sitting up and doing all this sort of thing. I don't think we can underestimate that peer exposure. So I think playgroups and just play dates, just mixing with other kids is incredibly important. And that's where I think the regression will be very much more obvious in terms of behavioural markers and milestones. So that means rehabilitating or promoting or creating opportunities and nurturing social interaction, because they're probably missed out on the natural moments. But we have to actually get in there and facilitate it. Now, the good thing about development is that it is, I call it plastic. You know, we can stretch it, we can push it, we can regress it, we can all sorts of things. The children have a remarkable ability to make up ground and compensate and get there in the end. So I think we should be confident that if we focus on where they are and nurture and nourish what they need as best we can understand it, that they'll get there where they should be, but it'll take time. It'll take a bit of time.
Thanks heaps, Rob.
Yeah.
There was just a comment here from Belinda really regarding the advice from meeting children who have regressed at their developmental age and trusting that innate urge to move forward developmentally. So just
yes, have confidence in the developmental process. Where it's difficult is, you know, for some kids are really having trouble. Just like we can say with kids at school, if they go into a regression, they can't cope with their schoolwork much. So, you know, it's good for them to be at school and we don't expect too much. And when they come out of that stressful state, I've seen it in the work I used to do at the Children's Hospital, that when the kids are ready, they will actually start galloping forward and they will make up the ground quickly, unless they do have a specific learning problem. And that's when actually, if you combine stress with a learning problem, it can throw things seriously out of kilter. So I think during this time, it's also important, and we know that our kids often have all sorts of issues to deal with. It could be learning problems, it could be emotional difficulties, it could be poor coordination or inhibition in being adventurous and so on. All the kids have got struggles to overcome of different sorts. But what I'd say is that over this next 6 months, really watch carefully, and if they're not making up ground, I think this is where really just to get the right professional people to make an assessment. An assessment is such a valuable thing so that you really understand what's going on, where the difficulties are, how you can support them. And don't leave it too long, because this COVID disruption is going to put a lot of pressure on kids who've, you know, are trying to hold it together for various reasons. So that I think to really give them that understanding and support at an early stage is going to be a really important thing to minimise the potential for missing out on some of their developmental experiences. So, you know, I'm sure there'll be services around, particularly in the bushfire communities, but even if you're outside the bushfire communities, don't hesitate to actually ask for the support you need. It's a very important time for that.
Rob, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more around the reactions of children with the impending, I guess we call it disaster season, or the upcoming summer season, and how to kind of people that have experienced, or children that have experienced last summer, what can we be doing now to support those children who are having anxieties or feeling a little bit uncertain about what's coming up?
Yeah, it's a good point. Now, what I've been hearing is actually some kids are a little bit anxious about it, but a lot of kids are not, it's not in their mind yet. And I think it's important to have the timing right, particularly young children. It's green, it's been raining, they're grappling with all the COVID issues. I think it's going to be different when the wind's hot, the grass is brown, and the smoke from burn-offs billowing around. So what I think we need to be prepared for is not to start talking about it too soon, but to be ready for it according to as the season starts to bring the experience back. Now, we know that when you go through a disturbing experience, you have this state of heightened arousal, we call it. And the kids have it too. They're worried. They even feel worried because they know parents are worried. Sirens going off, whatever. And so when this happens, the whole complex experience of, let's say, the lead up and then the impact of the fire leaves imprints, memories that are not properly processed because it's too chaotic and the kids are evacuated and they move out and they're in another environment. There's a whole lot of confusion. And so there are linkages between the sensory experiences, the smell of the smoke, the feel of the wind, the heat, the brown grass, people running around, sirens, loud noises, anything. And these are what we call the triggers. So that stimulus reawakens the loop that hasn't been processed properly and brings the anxiety that was there as part of the original experience back. And this is triggering the re-experiencing. Now, we don't know what our triggers are until we revisit the experience. So I think for both us adults and for the kids, as we go into the next season, we've got to work on the assumption I'm probably going to discover a series of triggers that I wasn't aware of. And I'm going to discover them the hard way by feeling anxious. I like to talk about how the blustery north wind makes the trees move on my boundary. And even in the winter after Black Saturday for a number of years, when there was a howling north wind that was cold with drizzle on it, made the trees jump around, I felt agitated because that was the way they moved in Black Saturday. And so I didn't realise that the movement of the trees was a trigger. And it took me a few years to sort of say, yeah, that's the north wind on the trees, that's all right. So it's, watch out for the kids. They might actually say, oh, I'm being triggered by this or that or the other, smoke of the barbecue next door. They might be just about running around wildly, being silly because they're agitated. Or they might say, Mummy, I've got a tummy ache or a headache, or I don't want to be outside, I don't want to be inside, I don't want to have a barbecue, I want to go inside and for you to make me some porridge, you know, whatever. So just try to keep your wits about you, think about triggers. And then that's where we need to talk. Now, the trigger is based on a similarity, isn't it? There was smoke in the bushfire, there's smoke at the barbecue. Smoke equals bushfire. No, it doesn't. This is different smoke. So we need to talk about, does this smoke remind you of the bushfire? But it's different smoke, smell it. Isn't that delicious? Fried onions and your favourite is roasted fish or something. And really engage them in the difference, in whatever feature it is, the difference. And if it's hot with wind blowing, you can say to them, we had a lot of rain. It's not like last season where we'd had a drought. We might have a bushfire, but it's going to be a different sort of bushfire. And by the way, this is our plan. This is what we learned. This is what we'll do. And this is why we haven't left yet, but this is when, you know, just talk about it. So that we actually take it out of this loop between sensory stimulus and emotional reaction and this looping going round and round, which many kids are not good at telling us about. Teenagers are more likely to, or maybe 9, 10-year-olds will start to talk about it. I'm worried about the fire. And try and share with them your own thinking about the danger so that we take it beyond just sensory intrusions.
Rob, I think that's a really important point you make there. We've had 2 comments specifically around the Victorian Emergency App and how the sound of the app going off on their phone, on the parent educator carer's phone, made the kids visibly anxious. So what you're saying is then have that moment happen and then talk about what we're going to do as a collective to be able to, if an event happens. Is that what you're...
That's right. A few adults have told me they don't like it. So what's happened is we call it a conditioned stimulus. That because the app was something everyone focused on in a time when they feel very anxious, app equals anxiety. Actually, if you read it, a lot of the information coming through is probably helpful information to know what's going on in the environment, or warnings of windstorms or various things. And so you might choose to, I don't know, just have it on vibrate. But you also might choose to share it and say, have a look, kids, there's a lot of stuff coming through this app that is not dangerous, but it's very helpful for us to know. And we know that when something dangerous happens, it will come through. Maybe it'll be a question about the design of the app of different sorts of signals, but we haven't got them. So I think talk with the kids so they get beyond thinking every time the app goes off, it means something dangerous is happening. No, it doesn't. Well, not for us anyway. It's something in the environment. It's about saying the app needs to be associated with knowledge and understanding of our whole environment, which gives us power and safety, because we've got a capacity to act. That's what the app has to be connected with. And even, I'm sure many of us who've been through fires will have to re-establish that relationship to the app. And we do that through talking. I'll tell you why talking is important. Because the trigger process belongs to the right side of our brain where our language isn't, because it's about short circuits between sensory inputs, sense of threat, and emotional response that leads to action. Loop. Sensory input, sense of threat, and a motivated behaviour. Now, what we need to do is get it in the left-hand side into words, because then we can think about it and not just react. We can say, yes, it's smoke, but it's not bushfire, it's burn-off. I know, because our DELPA doing burn-offs. The burn-offs are going to keep us safe. It's good smoke, right? And that means you're actually breaking up that single loop and going, we know now it's all about going through other parts of the brain and making it more complicated. That's talking about it makes it more complicated, and that allows us to get control of it. And then we use that to talk about our preparedness and our plans.
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate your time today. And thank you everyone actually for joining us for today's session with Dr. Rob Gordon. We hope you have got some good takeaways that you can use to support the children and young people in your lives. A special thanks to Dr. Rob Gordon. Just a reminder that this session was recorded, and shortly I'll send you a link to the recording, as well as a survey to help us improve our content and delivery, and also just asking if there are other things that you feel that you would need to talk about that we could get experts like Rob in to support. I would also strongly encourage you to visit the Red Cross website at redcross.org.au to access resources that will assist you, your family, and your community supporting children coping with crisis. But equally, I'll send those links in the resources out to you. Just a reminder that this was one of a series of webinars, so please keep an eye out on the Red Cross website, or touch base with your local Red Cross Bushfire Recovery Officer for more information. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Until next webinar, thank you and goodbye. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jamie. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.